What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Eddie Liger Power Hour. I'm probably yelling right now because I have headphones on, which I don't normally have, but I need to get a speaker set up for my new computer. We did it, everybody. In one stream, we raised enough money for me to get a new computer. Just kidding. It was gifted to me by a great comrade by the name of Jesus Motorcycle. Everyone go follow Jesus Motorcycle on X. He does great work. He's the one who does those really, really high quality AI videos for the ACP. So he had an extra computer and he hooked your boy up. So I don't have to be limited streaming to you guys from my iPad right now. But if you could let me know how the I have blonde hair also. We'll cover that in a second, but let me know how the audio sounds. Let me know how the visuals look, because obviously this is the first time from the new computer, so I want to make sure everything is working a-okay. Today we've got an extra special episode of the Power Hour coming at you. We're going to be talking about Yugoslavia, former socialist Yugoslavia, and the NATO and US bombing of Yugoslavia. And really the war, the all-around hybrid war that was waged on Yugoslavia by Western finance capital, which so-called socialists, self-described leftists like Vaush, Bush, and Slavoj Žižek, also which they still support to this day. They claim that NATO ended a genocide in former Yugoslavia or in Serbia, which is a completely absurd, ludicrous narrative, as you'll see today. Not only am I going to go into the background of Yugoslavia and the US bombing, but I've also got an extra special interview that I already pre-recorded for you guys with somebody who was stationed there in what's now Kosovo, or it was Kosovo at the time, who was stationed in former Yugoslavia at the time when a lot of this stuff was going down right after the US bombings. And he's going to give a firsthand look into what he experienced and give us some information that might not be common knowledge. Give us some information that might be outside of what Michael Parenti wrote in his excellent book, To Kill a Nation, The War on Yugoslavia. But anyways, we'll get into all of that awesomeness after the intro.
High Sheriff Hazard is a hard man to be. High Sheriff is his only plan. He digs through pockets, takes what he can, for he's High Sheriff Hazard. He caught me one evening and here's what he said. You look like a Russian, you look like a red. And if you're fond of your skin and your head, beware the High Sheriff of Hazard.
All right, let's get into it, everybody. I'm excited for this topic, as is Serbian Stalin. I guess that makes sense. Stalin was actually from Georgia, but the Serbian Stalin is a username that fits what we're going to be talking about today. Tackle this super chat right off the bat. Thank you so much, Pee Wee Gymnast, for the super chat. Says, do you think Turkmenistan is based? It certainly was. It certainly was based. I wouldn't say so much anymore, but Turkmenistan was part of the Soviet Union, and they saw a lot of economic development under the Soviet Union, as all these countries did, and they saw a lot of worsening economic conditions afterwards. I can't remember. I get confused with the post-Soviet history of the Central Asian countries, like, who went full neoliberal and who didn't, and which ones are highly anti-communist versus which ones are less so. But yeah, that's about all I got. So thank you. Thank you for the super chat, though. Let me adjust my thing here. Sorry, new setup, getting it all worked out still. All right, that looks better, I think. So today we are going to be talking about socialist Yugoslavia. Let me pull up a map for you guys, so you can get an idea. What Yugoslavia is now known as the Balkans, because they were Balkanized, which is, I don't know if the word Balkanized was invented pre or post dissolution of Yugoslavia. I don't know if this is what coined the term or what, but basically the whole country was split up into a bunch of smaller countries. So Yugoslavia was formed with the fall of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, and it was formed out of multiple countries, those being Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Bosnia Herzegovina as well, and then what's now Kosovo, which is like the Israel of Europe. I don't recognize Kosovo myself, and many countries still don't, besides the Western imperialist countries. So they were formed at like the end of World War I, of course, when those two big empires fell or started to dissolve, and eventually that led to World War II, where Croatia decided to side with the Axis powers, with Hitler and the Nazis. And this is where the infamous Ustasi, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the infamous right-wing Hitler-aligned military forces of Croatia emerged. And these were known for being, or they were known for being so brutal towards Jewish people, towards Romani people, and also towards Serbs, that they actually made the Nazis uncomfortable. They made the Nazis say, yo, maybe you guys should cool it with the massacres and the tortures and the rape. So if you're making the Nazis say, hey guys, you're being a little bit over the top here with the violence, you're probably doing something wrong. But there was a staunch resistance to fascism that was formed in the region, led mostly by partisans and communists. And one of the leading figures in this fight was Joseph Tito, who ended up leading the struggle against the Nazis, kicking them out, and after World War II, with Soviet backing, seizing power. And at this point, the unified countries and ethnicities that make up Yugoslavia became a unified socialist state, socialist Yugoslavia. Now, it's interesting because it's a plurinational or pluriethnic state, meaning there are multiple different ethnicities which are unified under this one socialist government, this one socialist state, this one country, which is, similar to what we have in the U.S., not the same thing at all. But obviously in the U.S., it's easy for us to envision that because we have lots of ethnicities living under one sort of what you could call a civilizational state. Now, Yugoslav socialism was very different from Soviet socialism. There was a very high profile or very infamous break between Joseph Tito and Joseph Stalin. The Yugoslav socialists went more towards a market-based socialism. One that was rooted in worker cooperatives more so than, state ownership and central planning. There was central planning and state ownership, but the way they did it was a little bit different. And obviously I agree with Stalin more so than I agree with Tito. in most of the debates that they were having at the time, but it did provide a unique socialist experiment to where a socialist country like China could come along later and say, okay, we need to make an economic policy, right? We need to make our 5-year plan for the economy. Let's look at what the Soviet Union did. Let's look at what socialist Yugoslavia did, and then let's compare and contrast and take what's best for us. So it did provide a unique socialist experiment that future socialists could draw from. So it gave us that. But one of the biggest mistakes, I mean, and things functioned relatively well ever since the dissolution of socialist Yugoslavia. Obviously, there were problems in Yugoslavia, but ever since the dissolution, the country has been a disaster. All sorts of ethnic conflict. You know, the economy has been completely stagnant. Or not completely, but mostly stagnant. And there's a saying in Serbia that, like, if a light bulb, say, isn't working, your old Serbian mother will say, well, if Tito was still around, this would work. Meaning basically nothing was working after socialism and everything was functioning more efficiently under socialism. And of course, you know, you can already imagine what the U.S. strategy was with Yugoslavia: to inflame ethnic conflict, to inflame ethnic divisions, to inflame the hostilities between different ethnicities and nationalities that made up this pluri-ethnic socialist state. And they did so quite well, unfortunately. But one of the biggest mistakes that Tito made was in the 1960s, 1961, he accepted IMF loans from the International Monetary Fund, this Western backed giant banking financial institution that was set up after World War II, which has become infamous since that time for debt trapping countries, for loaning countries money, giving them financing at absurdly high interest rates. And then when those countries want to refinance their loans or want to adjust those loans, the U.S. says, okay, we'll do it, but only if you do what we want politically. Only if you get rid of the minimum wage and get rid of these protectionist tariffs and basically allow Western corporations to just pillage your economy. So that was a huge mistake by Tito. They were in a rough situation, you know, like the global financial system after World War II, with the formation of the IMF and World Bank, were set up in a way to where, you know, if you don't do business with the US, if you don't do business with the IMF and the World Bank, it's very, very, very difficult to get any kind of financing. But Yugoslavia wasn't able to sort of work within the global financial system as skillfully as, say, China was under Deng Xiaoping. And ultimately, it was extremely costly and was one of the main things that led to their demise. So obviously, as the IMF loans are infiltrating this country and making them more poor and trying to, you know, sabotage everything they do economically, as the U.S. is engaging in economic warfare and economic sabotage, U.S. intelligence agencies are funding and promoting separatism and ethno-nationalism. They're saying, hey, Croatia, you don't want to be a part of this big country, this socialist country with Serbians. You hate Serbians, don't you? Here's some guns to fight the Serbians, essentially. And one of the main and most violent and most useful separatist groups that the U.S. ended up getting behind was known as the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army. They were known terrorists. Every country in the world had the KLA listed as a known terrorist group, not only for their tactics, you know, killing civilians, taking hostages, all sorts of different terror tactics, but also they were a separatist ethno-nationalist group, right? They were trying to dissolve a sovereign country based on the idea, or based on an ethno-nationalist idea that we need our own country with only our people in it. So the Kosovo Liberation Army, at this time, Kosovo wasn't a thing, right? But they were fighting for this country to be carved out of South Serbia called Kosovo. And the U.S. ended up removing these people from the list of known terror groups so that they could give them a bunch of arms and a bunch of funding. They tried a similar thing recently in Western China, in the Xinjiang region, with this group called the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which was an extremist group, terrorist group, had committed a bunch of horrific terrorist attacks. And the U.S. loosened the restrictions on them so that they could recruit more people and they could be more active, because, of course, the U.S. will use any actors that it can, any proxies that it can, to attack their enemies. Just look at how they've gotten behind, literal neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion in Ukraine as a way to attack Russia. So this is nothing new for the U.S., the funding and arming of these groups like the KLA, but it does kind of it gives away the game as to what they were actually doing versus the propaganda narrative, because the propaganda narrative is that the U.S. went in there and stopped the genocide. They bombed Serbia and put a stop to the evil Serbian genocide, when in reality, the conflict between different ethnicities was being stoked by the U.S. from the very beginning. The U.S. was doing everything they could to inflame ethnic divisions, and then they go in there and bomb Serbia and say, yay, we stopped all the ethnic divisions. And then idiot leftists, idiot so-called socialists like Slavoj Žižek and Vauš come out here and say, yeah, you guys did it. You did it. You stopped the terrorists from killing each other by giving them guns and then dropping bombs on them, or dropping bombs on the people who are fighting the terrorists. So anyways, countries started breaking off under IMF pressure and under all of these ethnic divisions and ethnic tension that had been sowed by the U.S., which were there already. They were latent between the different groups there, but the U.S. just poured fuel on the fire, essentially. So countries start breaking off in the 90s, countries like Croatia, but that wasn't enough for the U.S. They wanted the total destruction of Yugoslavia and what remained of the socialist economy. So it's at this point in the 1990s, after the dissolution or the breakup had already started, that the U.S. begins funding, arming, and backing the KLA. But the country of the countries that made up former Yugoslavia, the one that held on to most of their socialist economy, most of the state-owned firms and companies that had their profit reinvested in the people rather than going towards Western corporate shareholders and stuff, was Serbia. Serbia had a lot of these, mining industries and steel processing plants and things like that were actually able to compete with the U.S. and U.S. corporations in the global market. They were doing pretty well. They were pretty successful in bringing in a lot of revenue for the country. And that the Serbs became the primary target of the U.S., which is why they started backing these terrorists who wanted to carve a part of Serbia out of Serbia for themselves. So I had something else I wanted to say about that, but I can't remember. And if you look at I'll get into this later. So basically what the U.S. did was they set up the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia, which was a kangaroo court backed by the U.S. that was essentially designed to accuse Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of Serbia at the time, of genocide. So basically, they wanted to take all of this legitimate ethnic conflict and ethnic warfare that was happening, which the U.S. had created and stoked, and then blame it all on Milosevic and saying that he was doing a genocide of the Bosnian Serbs. Now, he was never convicted, and in fact, the International Criminal Tribunal released information recently, which I'll show to you now. Not recently, but in like 2016 it was. They had a ruling, and buried in that ruling, it said that Milosevic was essentially exonerated, that they could never find evidence to lay at his feet that was enough to convict him of committing a genocide. But despite that, President Bill Clinton at the time, despite the lack of evidence, publicly accused Milosevic of genocide. Every mainstream outlet in the media parroted it. You had, of course, so-called leftists like Slavoj Žižek parroting it. A lot of leftists still parrot this narrative to this day, actually, accusing Milosevic of genocide. And then Bill Clinton decided to launch the bombing of Serbia and former Yugoslavia. Now, if you look at the targets that were hit by NATO bombs at this time, it was power plants. It was, mining, whatever you call them, places where they were extracting metal and ores from the earth. They were factories. They were processing plants. They were farms. The goal wasn't to stop a genocide. It was to destroy the Serbian economy, what remained of the socialist economy, and these state-owned companies who were competing with U.S. corporations on the global markets. And tons of civilians died. The two major socialist headquarters, the headquarters of the two major socialist parties there, were both bombed. It was very obviously, just by looking at the targets of the bombings, you can see what was actually going on. They weren't trying to stop any genocide. They were trying to destroy socialism, or what remained of socialism at that point. And, you know, after all of this bombing was finished, the U.S. and Bill Clinton took credit for ending a genocide. Right. And this is still what these idiots like Vaush and Slavoj Žižek say to this day. Oh, it was good that NATO ended a genocide in former Yugoslavia. They stopped that darn Milosevic for doing a genocide. And if you look at the statistics, the number of ethnic killings, the number of killings between one ethnicity and another, which were rampant in Yugoslavia in the 90s, increased both during and after the NATO bombs. So not only did they not stop a genocide, they increased the ethnic conflict and the ethnic killings that were going on. So just on that stat alone, the fact that ethnic conflict increased after the U.S. bombings completely disproves this narrative that socialist so-called philosophers like Slavoj Žižek just swallow whole. I'm sorry, Carlos, but your whole field is garbage. Slavoj Žižek is disgusting. And if he loves bombing Serbia so much, he should let the U.S. military or NATO drop his fat ass on Serbia. But anyways, the U.S. took credit for ending this genocide, which in fact, if there was an ongoing genocide, it's one that they inflamed. So this is an enduring narrative on the left, even to this day. There are a lot of people who truly believe, who truly have themselves convinced that the U.S. and NATO stopped the genocide, that this was completely defensive. There was a recent interaction between Tucker Carlson and Piers Morgan, actually, where Piers Morgan was parroting this myth, and Tucker Carlson was destroying him, saying, "Who attacked us?" Piers Morgan was trying to say the NATO bombing was defensive, and Tucker said, "Who attacked us? Who in Yugoslavia attacked us? In what way was it defensive?" And Piers, of course, had no answer. But a lot of the information I'm giving you today are from Michael Parenti's great book, To Kill a Nation, which everybody should read. I have a copy up there. I don't want to dig it out right now. But recently, I learned that my good friend and comrade Wade of the American Communist Party was actually stationed in what's now Kosovo during the early 2000s, right after the NATO bombing. So I reached out to him and I said, "Wade, how much would you be comfortable sharing on the show?" So we sat down for about a 2-hour conversation. We talked about his time. We talked about the whole situation with Yugoslavia in general. We talked about China's anti-extremism programs in Xinjiang, what China's done to try and prevent anything like this from happening, to prevent a U.S. armed and backed group like the KLA from destroying their country and destroying Chinese socialism. It was a really great conversation, and there was a lot that Wade told me that, there's a lot that Wade has in terms of knowledge that I wish he could share, but obviously he's there's only so much that he can share publicly, but we made a plan for him to share everything that he possibly could with us. And that's what I'm going to play for you now. I'm really excited about it. This is going to give everybody a firsthand look into the U.S. and NATO-backed destruction of former Yugoslavia, which is a topic that I and we together at here at the Midwestern Marx channel have been talking about for a long time, for many years. But I think this firsthand experience will hit on some things that we haven't discussed before, and will give people a really good idea of what was going on the ground. So without further ado, here's Wade. Please, because I'm streaming this from my new computer for the first time, please let me know how the audio sounds. Let me know if you can hear it, and if you can't hear it, we'll have to get it fixed. But anyways, I'll be back after the interview, y'all. Enjoy. What's up, everybody? I'm here with Wade of the ACP, comrade here in the belly of the beast, the U.S. empire. We've got a very special interview today talking about Yugoslavia, which many of you know is a topic that I've been interested in for a really long time. I've got a copy of Michael Parenti's To Kill a Nation here, a book that I would recommend for anybody who wants to learn more about the things that we discuss in this interview today. But there are going to be some things we talk about in this interview that actually aren't in Parenti's book, because Wade happens to have firsthand experience being deployed to former Yugoslavia at the time when the U.S. was trying to kill the nation, as Michael Parenti said. And they did so by stoking ethnic fighting, arming a group known as the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which previously had been considered a terrorist group by almost every country on earth. The U.S. removed them from the list of terror groups, gave them a bunch of arms and guns, and eventually ended up almost carpet bombing Serbia in an effort to dissolve what was formerly a sovereign socialist state and turn it into what are now the Balkans, where there's still a ton of ethnic fighting and conflict, and where there are more NATO troops stationed in what's now Kosovo than anywhere else on earth. So thanks for being with us, Wade.
Happy to be here.
You bet. So I'm going to start out by letting Wade give a short summary of his time. Obviously, you know, there's certain information that he's not able to devolve to us, but I'm going to give him the floor here to talk about his experience and share with us any information that he can without putting himself at risk. So go ahead, Wade.
Absolutely. Back in 2001, actually, I got to rewind that. I joined the U.S. Army back in 2000. I was like within the first week, you know, I was at basic training and all that. I specifically joined as an intelligence analyst, and so I ended up doing. I ended up going to school at Fort Huachuca in the Army College or Army Intelligence College. The reason I joined specifically was in my high school years, I had, you know, witnessed the CNN covering the Rwandan genocide, and I don't know, something, you know, was very, very vivid about that. Something, and I was like, this has to stop. This kind of stuff can't, you know, go on. And I was furious that we were doing nothing about it, because I guess we didn't care about Rwanda, right? And it didn't occur to me that there was any kind of imperialism. I still was one of those kids grew up under lower middle class suburban America, right? So be all you can be was something that I believed in. Was the Army's motto at the time, and I joined to do just that. I knew for a fact from high school that there was the Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, ethnic cleansings going on, which is what CNN was constantly telling us at the time. And when the Kosovo bombings happened in '99, I was in a high school class called Racism, Hatred, and Genocide, and it was one of the things that came up. And I thought to myself, well, I got to do something about that. Like, I'm not going to just, I want to get involved, right? So as soon as I could, I joined the military specifically to, and I directly stated as part of my contract, I wanted to go specifically to whatever base it was that was heading directly over to Kosovo, right? Well, or, former Yugoslavia. They said that was Fort Drum, and they asked me if I was sure, because, Fort Drum sucks. It is one of the worst cold weather bases in the world. Like, everybody hates that. They try to avoid Fort Drum. Are you sure you want to do that? I'm like, yeah, put it in my contract. I'm going. You understand me? So that was part of the deal. And that it really happened not very long after I got out of Intel school. I deployed in 2001, and I deployed right about the time where the KLA, UCK, whatever you want to call them, was having a conflict over in what's now Northern Macedonia, or in Skopje. And I arrived at Camp Monteith, no kidding, when they were still launching mortar attacks into the Capitol. And my first experience with the deployment was watching these old Soviet, that the Macedonians, or pardon, the Northern Macedonians had. Gosh, the old Hindies. So these things were lighting up these mortar positions, and they were flying overhead, and it was just raining freaking massive Soviet shells on top of our heads. And I was like, oh, okay, like this is what former Yugoslavia is like. And it wasn't very long. We spent only a little bit of time there. We weren't allowed to. Apparently, they were very insistent that the US and NATO kept out of their airspace, and so we had no ability to we relied on that air power, their air power, to protect the base. But once that was over, because we were on a delay, we went straight to Camp Bondsteel, where I participated in Task Force Falcon, Multinational Brigade East, and that's when the mission started. So the most interesting part of that is about less than 2 weeks after getting to the Camp Bondsteel, I was put on, to get rid of me, because I was a sort of a smart mouth. They put me on a detail with the CID, which is Criminal Investigation Detachment. And the CID was tasked with trying to find these mass graves, because the ongoing, or the current, I guess, theory or whatever was that the reason they couldn't find the mass graves that everyone was saying was a thing was because they were dug up and moved, right? So we were tasked.
And was the U.S. already pushing the narrative of Serbian genocide at this point?
Oh, yeah, no, we were told that we were investigating Serbian genocide. This was we were trying to find crimes against Milosevic, and especially, and this is the first, like, this, I hadn't even heard the name until I'd gotten over there. This guy called Drago, which everyone just referred to as the Dragon. And Drago was the prime suspect that everyone was really concerned with, even though everybody was also concerned with tying these somehow to Milosevic, right?
And Drago, for the record, ideologically is a Serbian nationalist, not a communist. He was leading a brigade on behalf of the socialist government, but he himself was a Serb nationalist, whereas the media propaganda narrative at the time, from what I understand, is that Milosevic was the one orchestrating this unprovoked and unnecessary genocide.
Right, exactly. Now, I'm 19 and stupid, so I don't really know much about it. We were given these basic summaries of the history, in our training, and specifically the Intel group, or the S2 as they called it. Yeah, and so what we knew is KLA good guys, and Serbians bad guys, right? That was the narrative that we were sold. So I went fully thinking that I was helping to uncover these crimes, right? And one of the things that we did uncover were mass graves. We got locals reporting it, etc. But the thing that was that kept happening when we were investigating these grave sites was that we would find we would find, look, this is going to get gruesome, and I do apologize, but the remains were most often charred fragments of human beings. It was never like a traditional execution style that you would see. It was always like people who had been bombed. And when we really looked at it, we all sort of had the same conclusion, like this was like an aerial attack, and they didn't really conduct aerial attacks like that. before the NATO bombing. And so the only thing that, we could conclude was that these were, victims of NATO bombing. But everybody kept on going, no, those were the people who were killed by the Serbians. And we're like, well, that doesn't track. It doesn't. I mean, and being so close to the NATO bombing as we were, in as far as the timeline and the chronology of it, it just made all the sense that these, because that's the other part. They weren't older remains either. They were relatively new, right? Wasn't like, 10, 20 years ago. This was within the last, couple years type thing.
And the NATO bombs were 1999 they began, right? And you're there in 2000, so.
Well, 2001.
2001, so very soon after.
But it was very soon after, right? And of course, that was the other reason why they said, oh, well, they've had a year to, hide their crimes, so now we've got to, go looking after these things. But all of the locals, or when I say the locals, what I should be, specific, and no heat on the local Albanians. It's not, it wasn't their or ethnic Albanians, I should say. It wasn't, their fault. They didn't, they were told go find stuff, and they came back and they found stuff, right? I mean, these are, not people that were agents of anything. But what's interesting is a lot of the people that found stuff were also people who were employed by UCOM in Halliburton, right? So
this was the time when Dick Cheney, the president of Halliburton, was the vice president of the United States.
Right. Now, I mean, these, I'm making, connections that, there's clearly a plausible deniability, but looking back on it, it's really sort of a Captain Hindsight moment where it's like, we were getting tip-offs from who? Anyway, so we covered this stuff, and then of course we came to our conclusions, and this is not just me, this is like an entire team, and I was just the intel guy, so I was in charge of really just taking care of the maps, making sure that we could tie it to specific sites where we that made sense, right? Because the idea was we have to also do the analysis and make sense that this from here to here is where this happened, and that and there these are the remains from that result, and this is how they could to sort of establish how the remains could have been moved from the area where they were originally considered to be the massacre, and why they're over here now, right? That was my job. But as far as like the investigating, the details of the bodies and the, that these were conclusions that CID was coming up with, not me. So like just to take a little bit of, I'm not saying that I'm more qualified, to do crime scene analysis, right? I'm not CSI. Anyway, so we came across a number of these things, one of them, outside of Kamenica, one outside of Milani, and the only one that that we found where the bodies were really, intact, and you could tell that they had been, executed. Those were actually real, that and they were bodies that had been moved, and so we're like, oh, we did find something. How about that? So we did the investigation on who they were, their origins, and every last one of them, and I mean every last one of them, came up as former KLA or people who were specifically dealing with and providing resources to the KLA. We brought that up as well, and the thing that really sort of got us, because we found this out later on, towards the end of our deployment, after all the work that we've done on this, is that those, like the evidence that we sent up with all of the charred remains, was dismissed as being, NATO origin. The parts where the body parts were charred and, you know, like clearly pieces of, like, that was left out entirely. And then they were all attributed to, you know, Drago and or the Dragon and Milosevic. And we were like, hold up, what, huh? That's not what our conclusion. So we're very confused. And then the second that we brought it up, we were all split up, the whole team. Everybody was split up and sent to, you know, different parts, you know, to do different, you know, tasks within, you know, Task Force Falcon. And then, you know, because of our duties, you know, and the new tasks that we were, you know, given, we sort of lost track of all of that, and we were, you know, constantly bombarded with an excess of, you know, new things to do. And for me, I ended up, you know, being the OSCE's editor for the Task Force Falcon, which was an open source intelligence, you know, publication. So yeah. And now, when it came to the bodies that were shot, the KLA, that did actually make it into the report, and that was attributed to both Drago and Milosevic and used against him in, you know, as evidence in The Hague.
Right. And the KLA had been considered, as we said at the beginning of the interview, an extremist terrorist group for years. So I guess, what was your impression of them being there? And, you know, do you know anything about why they had been classified as a terror group? Or these people who are committing atrocities? Or, yeah, what was your general impression?
So my general impression, and I hate to say this because, and actually I despise the fact that they put me in the position to serve alongside these people, but a lot of them were integrated into our, you know, base operations. So when I went to work for the open source intelligence operation, they were the translators that I worked with daily. I liked them. They seemed really freaking nice, and it makes me physically ill after, you know, years later, you know, looking back, doing the investigation, finding out what exactly I was involved in. It made me, it still makes me physically ill that I was working alongside people who were terrorists. They were terrorists. They were the ones that were out there, like, they were nationalists. So here's what it comes down to. They were ethno-nationalists, Albanian ethno-nationalists. They had for decades been terrorizing the Serbians in the entirety of the Kosovo region or province. And it turns out that NATO has their interests were really complemented with the KLA, right? So what happened, and why Kosovo specifically became a place of particular interest, is I think sometime in the mid 90s, and mind you, this was something that going along the entire command. Everybody, you know, sort of made jokes, like dark jokes, about how, you know, why we were there, and the thought process that we were all sort of on was that the reason that anybody was even interested in Kosovo, as opposed to the rest of the entire, because I mean, there was Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was, you know, there was a whole bunch of different theaters, you know, in the breakup of Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia. The main issue, the main interest there was that there in the north, in the northern mountains of Kosovo, there was an excessive amount of mineral wealth. Now, everybody likes to, you know, talk about the, you know, the lead and the, you know, zinc and all that stuff, but what we'd heard was there is an undisclosed, insane amount of gold up in those hills, and those are primarily Serbian occupied. Mm-hmm. So the KLA suddenly boosted in, you know, numbers, ranks, you know, like everything after that discovery, and there was a surge of support, you know, and the immediate redaction of their status as a terrorist organization almost immediately, and by this, just looking back at history and putting these things together. These are just correlations, right? So, but the correlations are pretty freaking strong. Suddenly, the U.S. and NATO became extraordinarily interested in Kosovo after what seems to be an undisclosed but hundreds of billions in gold.
And if you look at who NATO bombed, or the targets that NATO bombed, it was the mining industries, it was the factories, it was the Serbian and Yugoslav infrastructure that could be used to process these things, which were actually becoming competitive in the global markets with U.S. corporations.
Yeah. So, if I had to make a guess as to why suddenly the KLA were our best buddies and friends, and why suddenly we cared so deeply about them, and why Kosovo had to be liberated and made its own country, it would be because the vast majority of Albanians in Kosovo live below that mountainous region in the south and central parts of Kosovo, and they were basically the only disruptive force that was fighting to wrest control of that northern part from the Serbians, who, by the way, ethnically wise and historically, that's their home. They didn't come in. They didn't, invade. There was no, occupation. There was no historical claim that the KLA had on that northern region. But suddenly, when it became a source of vast wealth, everybody was interested in nabbing it up.
Interesting. And for those who don't know, Yugoslavia, it was really kind of brilliant. I think a lot of Americans will relate to it, how the way that it worked. It was a unified plurinational socialist state. So you had all these different ethnicities and nationalities who were all part of one country and one unified economy. And what the KLA was a separatist group, and like an ethno-nationalist separatist group, saying no, we need a country per ethnicity, or we need a different country for each nationality. So it'd be like almost, it's a little different, but like for Americans, if a certain ethnic group took up arms and started fighting to separate part of the U.S. into their own country, it would absolutely be considered terrorism or separatism if a certain ethnicity tried to take over Ohio. And break away from the rest of the country. So that's the kind of group that this was, and that's who the U.S. made bedfellows with in Yugoslavia, because they realized, because it was a plurinational socialist state, if they were to inflame ethnic conflict and nationalist divisions, they could break it apart, and that's exactly what they did. And it was Serbia that hung on to the remnants of the socialist economy, which is why they were the ones who ended up getting bombed. And today, the country known as Kosovo, that was carved out of Serbia, has more NATO troops occupying it than any other place on earth. There are more NATO troops there than anywhere else, even in other places where the U.S. has been heavily involved and has occupied, like Iraq or whatever. So I think it's pretty obvious what was going on there.
Sorry, give me a second. When the wifey calls, she's not happy not getting a response. Give me a second. Maybe edit this out. Give me a second. I really do.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, hold on. All right.
My apologies. I uploaded the wrong version, the unedited version where Wade's wife calls him. So let me skip ahead. Sorry about that. All right. I edited that out and then forgot to upload the edited version. Sorry, Wade. Sorry, Mrs. Wade. All right, we're back. And now there was basically a kangaroo court that was set up called the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia, which was created by the U.S. to convict Milosevic. Now, they never did. Milosevic was arrested and he died in prison under, there's a lot of suspicion as to what actually happened there when he was in prison. But they were never actually able to convict him. And years later, there was another ruling that they released, which had buried under, a ton of text that said, we don't have enough evidence to convict Milosevic. Now, what Parenti and others have argued is that there was, ethnic conflict going on. There were Serbian nationalists who, were fighting against these KLA forces and NATO forces and did do, legitimately violent things. But my question is, what was the role of the socialist government? What was the role of Milosevic? And what do you make of this narrative that he was the one orchestrating all of this ethnic conflict from the top down?
So as far as we knew, at least in the evidence that we gathered, he had to deal with the dragon, so to speak, which again, the Drago was the number one, like when anybody had something to say against the Serbians, the Drago came up and that was the end of the conversation. Now, everybody called Drago Milosevic's, pit bull, his attack dog, right? And I think that there is a reality to the fact that Milosevic had to deal with him as a necessary evil, because it's kind of one of those things. If you don't, then you get cooed. These guys were not screwing around. They were deadly. They were vicious. They were brutal. But they were deadly and vicious, and they were brutal. And this is not an apology for them and their tactics or the methodologies, and certainly not their ideology. But they were responding to decades of terrorism, that they'd experienced at the hands of these Albanian nationalists. And the KLA, which the entire world recognized was a terror. It wasn't just the U.S. that recognized that they were terrorists. The whole world recognized that they were terrorists. The KLA had antagonized that response. So I don't know how, because I didn't study this. And again, one of the ways that they keep intel on track and to keep them from going, hey, wait a second, why are we doing this, right? Because that's one of the dangers of having people who handle your information. If you want them to do the good work, you have to convince them that they're doing good work. So we were like, a lot of the stuff that I know now was omitted when we were going after this information. And when it comes down to it, at the time I just thought that he was Milosevic's attack dog. But when you look at the history, as we as historical materialists do, there wasn't really much of a connection between Milosevic and Drago, apart from the necessity of not interrupting him while he was going out of pocket. Mm-hmm. And when he went out of pocket, it was brutal. It was absolutely monstrously brutal. And I will say that it does seem like he mainly focused on the KLA, but I won't say that civilians didn't get caught in that crossfire. So yeah, but to tie it to Milosevic, absurd. Right.
Yeah, there's a tendency I've noticed among Serb nationalists to kind of scoff at the death and destruction and violence that was going on. I don't agree with that. It was brutal. It's war. War is brutal. Right. But there are historical factors that led to that. And what's really absurd is the narrative trying to pin it on the socialists or say that this is because of socialism. Everything that was done was in response to NATO and the arming of terror groups. And it was the socialists, who were mostly trying to keep the peace. They didn't want any of this to happen.
Right. That's exactly it. They wanted to keep the peace. They wanted to find economic solutions, to the conflicts. They wanted to, find some way to alleviate the suffering of, the economic suffering. Because it's look, anything south, like there's lignite, which is like a low grade, coal, in the central and south of Kosovo, but there's not really much in the way of mineral wealth, and there's certainly not much in the way of value of the land as far as what you can turn it into, industrialize or whatever. So they were economically depressed area. It's just it's the nature of it'd be like kind of like the steppes in China. If you're all the way up in that high altitude. Well, and mind you, I'm not saying it was the high altitude in Kosovo. I'm just saying like the relative economic like ability to just get anything out of it wasn't great. Wasn't very profitable. So they weren't wealthy people. I guess Tito might have attempted to develop it, and I will say that is the case. But I don't think the disparity between that area and all other areas was significant, and I can see that with my own eyes. So Milosevic had tried to make some economic appeasement to try and alleviate the sources of tension, but ultimately that failed because of NATO antagonism to
and they were already infiltrated by the IMF and World Bank at that point.
Right.
Tito made a massive mistake in the 70s, I believe, of allowing or taking IMF loans, which were being used to debt trap Yugoslavia and weaken their economy, so it was harder. And Wade and I talked about this a different time. The U.S. tried this same strategy in Western China in the Xinjiang region, which is what he was talking about there, this elevated region, where people were poorer, so they were more susceptible to opportunism, being bribed by imperialism. And you had a bunch of insane extremist attacks by the ETIM, another group that the U.S. took off of the terror list, off of the official list of terror groups. And what China did was responded by giving them economic development.
That's sort of what I was alluding to. Yeah, that's exactly what I was alluding to.
Yeah.
And there was an attempt, but it was no traction to it. They weren't able to. And at that time, in former Yugoslavia's history, everything was falling apart. They couldn't stop the nationalists on any side from intensifying the conflict, and any attempts to make things right were ultimately either destroyed by one side or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. I have one more question for the interview today. So the narrative, too, that I'm often combating online or whatever is that the U.S. bombing actually stopped all of the ethnic fighting and it stopped this genocide. But if you look at the statistics, the number of ethnic murders increased both during and after the NATO bombing. So you were there after the NATO bombing.
I've got 100% a refutation of that. There was an incident over in excuse me. Can we pause? I'll give my answer. Free. Yeah.
Yo, sorry. I had myself muted. I'm skipping the conversation. Sorry, Wade. We'll skip the conversation between Wade and Mrs. Wade. And then we had to stop laughing because we're talking about atrocities. So that wouldn't be a good look. All right, I think we're back.
Oh, right.
We're back.
Okay. So I 100% have a refutation of that entire narrative. So while I was there, there was this situation that happened in the town of Sturpsy, right? So in Sturpsy, a mayor was elected after the NATO bombings, right? But before my particular iteration of Task Force Falcon had shown up. Now, when this election happened, there was a Drago and Milosevic at the time had told them not to cooperate. The town of Sturpsy, Sturpsy was predominantly 70% Serbian, right, but 30% Albanian or ethnic Albanian, right? So they were told not to vote at all. The Serbians there was a moratorium. There was a direct threat actually to their lives. You will not vote in this election because there was nobody was to cooperate with NATO, right? So NATO had this election happen. and the Serbs refused to vote. The one guy who went outside of those directives, the one Serbian, he went around trying to get the Serbians to vote, and because of that, he ended up executed. And the reason that I found this out was when I was working with the OSCE and the open source intelligence operation. I was put onto it by one of the interpreters who was like, we have 2 interpreters that speak Serbian, and if you want to know the reason why this is happening over here in Sturpsy, you might want to go talk to them. So I found them, and I did. And it turns out that these 2 were the daughters of the guy who was murdered for cooperating with NATO and trying to get this election going. So obviously, nobody voted, right, except for the Albanians. So there was this Albanian mayor that was, supposed to be installed, and like over and over, every operation that we committed to try and get this guy to just get him into the building, right, the town hall building, met with riots. Eventually, in the last operation, they're about to roll out some violent methods to make this happen. Now, I am not the kind of guy that likes to, sit on my hands and, let people die, endanger U.S. soldiers or even the people who are in there. So, this is why I started this investigation, unsanctioned, by the way, and it ended up getting me in trouble. But I did this investigation. I found out the reason why that was so, and I went into while they were preparing for this operation and the trucks were already starting to move. I went into the battle update briefing, and I was like, this is my information. This is this is what we found. This is everything that this has got, you guys need to hold another election, or otherwise there will be blood. They will, so they were chopping down. They were already chopping down the trees. They put the block the roads. There was like 20,000 people on one side, freaking 15,000 people on the other. Rocks were being thrown, and there was guaranteed they were going to attack the convoy, and the convoy had been armed. It had been armed, and there was worry that we were going to have to open fire. But looking back, I think that was kind of the point. I think they wanted that. That's speculation. I can't, again, just for purposes of, whatever. That's speculation. But I did come in and I gave them this information, and once they found out, it was because at the time there were. In this battle update briefing, there was, liaisons to the entirety of NATO, which meant a lot of other European eyes, and the operation was, caused a lot of stir amongst them, which caused the operation to be pulled or ramped down. Ultimately, got in a lot of trouble for doing that, but. It did, restore stability. So, like the idea that they were there to, create peace when they were trying to install a mayor that they knew for a fact was going to usurp the political, and democratic will of the people of Sturpsy.
And inflame an ethnic riot, like a mini ethnic war.
They'd already done that. They'd already
right.
multiple times. There had already been riots. The whole point of that entire convoy was to escalate.
Mm-hmm. That's so wild, and it tracks with the statistics. If you look at, and I'm sure the statistics that Parenti draws from aren't even 100% accurate. Those can be fuddled with and whatnot, and it's hard to count all of the dead in a war zone, especially one like that with so many theaters and like different paramilitary groups involved. But NATO did nothing but inflame the ethnic fighting. It increased after the bombings in the follow-up, and the idea that they went in there and put a stop to this genocide is so absurd, because there never would have been genocidal violence if it wasn't for the U.S. empire and NATO and their involvement. So Yeah, it's wild.
One other thing,
Yeah.
almost immediately afterwards, there was a terrorist campaign on the Serbian people in Sturpsy, and shop owner ended up losing his life to a bomb. So, it's. I mean, again, these are all correlations, but I mean, we all know what it looks like.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Wade, for your time. This has been extremely interesting. Is there anything else you would like to share about former Yugoslavia and your time there, or anything you want to promote that you got coming up?
No, I mean, there's obviously a whole bunch of stuff that there's not really at liberty to talk about. I wish I could, but ultimately, I do observe the law, so I'm not trying to end up in jail for any kind of disclosures that would be inappropriate. But free Palestine.
Absolutely, you bet. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was super informative. Solidarity. All right, we're back. Sorry for playing the unedited version like an idiot. After spending like an hour editing it today. I love doing stuff for no reason. WACP's in the chat. Let's go. W. Let's go. What did people think? W, law-abiding citizen. Thank you, Wade. Very brave. Yes, everybody thank Wade for his time and for his bravery in doing that interview. You like the hair? Thank you, comrade. Everybody thank Wade for that, because it's a risk, coming out and as a former member of the U.S. military, speaking out against it, calling out the U.S. empire for, the crimes that he knows they were committing. And, there can be a lot of individual guilt that comes with that, too. It's hard for veterans or troops sometimes to admit that, yeah, I fought for imperialism. I signed up to defend my country and was sent to destroy another one. So very cool that Wade was able to do that. Thanks, Wade. WACP, common ACPW. Very few Serbs are left in Kosovo. Yeah, exactly. These guys are freaking ethno-nationalists, essentially. I mean, Kosovo is a country founded by NATO and NATO-backed terror groups, really. So it's no surprise that they've driven all the Serbs out, or that the Serbs have left. But even more Roma were expelled. Yeah, which is interesting if you go back to like the ethno-nationalist groups in World War II, like the Ustazi. They were doing the same thing, targeting Jewish people, Roma people, and Serbs. So it's like the same kind of hateful, hyper-nationalist ideology is what the U.S. Stoked in Yugoslavia, the same way they did it in Ukraine with Project Aerodynamic, and with promoting, it's very similar with the way that the U.S. promoted these Banderites. Stefan Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist who sided with Hitler, and the U.S. kept that ideology alive in Ukraine, spent millions of dollars to do so. And ultimately, it led the country to become a pawn of NATO in this proxy war against Russia. And it's very important to understand the extreme extent that the U.S. went to in order to destroy Yugoslavia. And now, today, there are more NATO troops occupying Kosovo than anywhere else on Earth. And it's important to understand that because, one of Vladimir Putin's reasons for launching the SMO, one of his complaints, was that NATO promised to stop expanding after the USSR dissolved, but it keeps getting closer and closer to our borders. It keeps encompassing more and more countries. And that's, we're often told by the liberal media in the West that, these countries are just joining NATO for their own safety. They're so scared of Russia, they have to join NATO for their own safety. But look at Yugoslavia. The whole country was fucking destroyed and balkanized and sent into a state of civil war between ethno-nationalist groups, which continues to this day. Or just regular nationalist groups as well. And NATO did that in order to occupy the region and, of course, control the economy, but also to give themselves a base in East Europe, to create a little Israel in East Europe that serves U.S. interests. So this is the kind of stuff that Putin and Russia are talking about when they're mentioning NATO expansion, it's not just this like defensive thing, like NATO tripped and fell and all these countries joined it. You often hear this from those YouTube history channels that I hate so much. The like cartoon, well-produced history channels, NED funded, USAID funded history channels that'll say, you know, it's not the US's fault that all these countries want to join NATO because they're scared of Russia. No, they're not scared of Russia. They're scared of you. And they've seen that you will destroy them if they reject you. So that's the reason countries don't want to get on the bad side of NATO, not because they're scared of Russia. Oh yeah, I freaking hate those CIA history channels. I know, me too. Speaking of this region, speaking of East Europe, crazy what happened in Romania today. There was like a populist right, Donald Trump style politician who won. Politician talking about, you know, basically like some forms of economic leftism combined with like nationalism, very similar to the right-wing populists we've seen all around the globe coming to power, especially in this era of neoliberal decay. And he won the election and then was arrested. They just arrested him. The EU canceled the election, said, nope, we're in charge. You're a small little country. You're not allowed to do that. And they arrested him. So, I mean, I don't know the politics of that country very well, but I imagine that's not going to sit well with people. That's not going to sit well with the people who voted for him. I mean, it didn't sit well with Americans when they tried to convict Trump of a felony. Americans said this is lawfare, and they turned around and started supporting Trump more, which is a sign of how little people trust the institutions in our society and the legal system. But I imagine, you know, it would have been a riot. It would have been an uprising if they would have arrested him. I seriously think it would have been. So what's going to happen next? I don't know. I imagine people have to be enraged. I'm sure they were already enraged by the cancellation of the elections, but it's wild. It's wild to see what's going on with the EU, especially with, you know, Russia and the US. You had the weirdest UN vote of all time the other day. I can't remember what the specific vote was. It was something about Ukraine and Russia, but basically Trump voted with Russia, or the US voted with Russia, as did Israel. Of course, under US pressure, because the US actually controls Israel, not the other way around. Silly JQers. But it was then the EU, the European countries, who were going against it, who are like the last bastion of neoliberalism. It's like things are going in reverse. Like, you know, Europe was like the center of liberalism, and then it spread to the US, and the US became the dominant global neoliberal empire. And then now that the US's empire is declining, it's going back to Europe. Europe is going to be the last stronghold for neoliberalism. Not that Trump is going to bring an end to neoliberalism, but he's certainly throwing a monkey wrench in the whole machinery of the empire, especially with their going after institutions like USAID and whatnot. But yep, LOL, never thought I'd see it. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. But I guess it makes sense. You know, I guess that old money never left like London and Paris. It was the UN resolution based on Ukraine's plan to return quote-unquote occupied territories. Okay. Gotcha. Thank you, Zoya. By the way, speaking of Zoya, I'm going to be on RBN next Tuesday, I believe. I was really, really upset that I couldn't be on last Thursday when Noah was there. I happened to have, or whenever that was, I happened to have practice. Maybe it was yesterday. And I'll never let Noah do my scheduling for me. I shouldn't have let Noah do my scheduling for me. It's not his fault. It's my fault. But yeah, excited to do that. Excited to talk to Nick and the crew. Obviously love everything RBN is doing. I also talked to our boy Malumbo on the phone today. He's planning to push some ACP content out there. I'm really excited to see what he comes up with. He's going to try to help us with the recruitment drive. And he's also working on his RPG or his board game, which he's actually got like investors for now, which is like an RPG based in like African mythology. in like ancient African economies, and similar to like Asia and economies in the East, a lot of these African economies were very socialist, right? They were extremely communistic, what Marx and Engels would call primitive communism. So there's a lot of that in this game, this board game and potentially video game that he's making. So that's really cool. Could be a good business idea for the party. But yeah, that's neither here nor there. He's just Tuesday, 6 p.m. Eastern, RBN Midwestern Marks. Let's go. Get hype. Put it on your calendars. Set the reminder. Alexa, set a reminder to watch Midwestern Marks and RBN at 6 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday. I hope I just activated all of your Alexas. I just activated mine. I heard it. Yeah, I have an Alexa. Jeff Bezos is spying on me. I don't know. It's not smart. I gotta throw it out the window. Aren't Russia's annexations illegal? No, those countries or the Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea all voted to become part of Russia overwhelmingly. Crimea's never really been part of Ukraine. It was gifted to Ukraine, but they voted in the early 1990s actually to not be part of Ukraine and to rejoin Russia, but it was refused. But the votes in Crimea were extremely high. They were even higher than in like Donetsk and Lugansk, where it was like 80% support for joining Russia. In Crimea, it was like over 90%. It was kind of crazy. I have thus far resisted the Alexa temptation. Yeah, I'm waiting for them to program them with AI. Right now, Alexa, like once you get used to ChatGPT or DeepSeek and like using AI, then you talk to Siri or Alexa, they just seem stupid as shit. So I'm waiting for them to adapt AI tech. Lol, my Alexa def went off. Nice. I do not know the answer to this question. I don't know anything about Mengistu or Bar. I'm sorry. I don't have like an encyclopedic knowledge about everything that's ever happened like Michael Hudson. It makes me like jealous whenever I hear that guy talk. Like, well, 700 years ago in Singapore, this happened. Here's exactly what their economy looked like. And it's really interesting, actually. Like, what the shit? How do these people know so much? I heard DeepSeek. Me too. My Alexa went off. Ha ha! Now you all have a reminder set to watch me on RBN. Let's go. The higher standards of Yugoslavia were propped up by IMF money. That makes sense. So yeah, the other thing about those IMF loans is that they were probably funneling money to who, their preferred groups. And you're probably seeing now that the US has so many arms to do this. Like Trump and Elon are talking about getting rid of the deep state, which is a real thing. I don't know why I said the deep state, the national security state, these unelected bodies like the US intelligence agencies and the State Department. And then you have these USAID was actually connected to the government, but like the NED is a private version of the CIA that's not even directly connected to the government, which Elon has also criticized and said he's going to go after, which I hope he does. But there are all these different mechanisms that the U.S. can use to funnel money into their preferred groups and their preferred media outlets and their preferred politicians. And once you understand this, you see why it's so difficult for countries to build socialism, even though socialism is common sense and it's a superior mode of production. When you have all of these different arms trying to sabotage you, all of these arms that ultimately stem from capital, the capitalist ruling class, the finance capitalists, it makes it extremely difficult. There's, you're facing constant economic sabotage. You're facing sometimes direct bombings. You're facing the arming of these psychopathic human apes like the KLA or whatever, or the Azov Battalion or Al-Qaeda or whoever the U.S. can find to give a bunch of guns to. You're facing all these things, and China is just like Neo in the Matrix, just like, wow, pow, pow, bat them away, dodge, dodge, dodge. Ooh, you're going to fund terrorists in Xinjiang? Well, we're going to build some of the largest mosques in that region and give them a bunch of economic development. Now nobody's a terrorist anymore. Pow, 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 pow. Thought you had us, U.S. What's your stand on the Khmer Rouge? I don't know enough about it, but I know, I don't think Pol Pot was like the most well-read Marxist or like, anyone like people should uphold or follow or whatever. And I've heard stuff about him being backed by the CIA. But I mean, what's true is that for sure a lot of the deaths in Cambodia that were attributed to Pol Pot through the killing fields and in books or scholarship like the Black Book of Communism, a lot of those people were just killed by Henry Kissinger and US bombs. And then they said, oh, how could Pol Pot do this? So yeah, I don't know. Ask Haas. He knows more about the Khmer Rouge. Have you seen the actually, I know the Khmer Rouge cracked down really hard on academics. And sometimes when I'm dealing with academics, I get it. That's all I'm saying. Just kidding. Of course. Just kidding. Have you seen the Miami Cuban media outlets funded by USAID freaking out because of their funds being cut off? No, I haven't seen that. That's hilarious, though. Suck it, Miami Cuban media outlets. Thank you, Battle Cossack, for the super chats. That is so funny. It's those kind of media outlets who totally orchestrated SOS Cuba, that color revolution attempt that got my TikTok banned for the first time because I was speaking out against it. But it was wild. There were like total front companies set up, by the US, and you could trace the finances of these companies. They'd like appear out of nowhere and start pushing all this propaganda. It was a total like totally coordinated like social media coup attempt. Like they tried to do the Arab Spring in Cuba essentially. And I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised if higher ups at Twitter were actually in on it, because that's where a lot of this stuff happened. And I believe like the day before SOS Cuba, a lot of like anti-imperialist, pro-Cuba, pro-communism voices were like shut down or like banned, including mine. My TikTok account was banned. I was probably the largest account at the time saying, hey, this is a CIA-backed color revolution against the socialist state. It's not, this freedom-loving revolution. Now, thankfully, there's more people on TikTok who, see the world for what it is. But back then, it was slim pickings, man. All the socialists were like, yes, rise up. The socialists. Rise up, Cuban people. Overthrow your terroristic socialist government. Training you into doctors, forcing you to read the tyranny. Fuck SOS Cuba, fuck the Western left. True. Hakeem does not like Haas. It's not about liking people in this political struggle. It's about uniting towards common goals and advancing the class struggle. So I hope they can get over it. This is a really good question that I don't know the answer to. I've heard that before. I don't think it would have hurt. I don't know if I could have saved the whole thing because it was already in the process of collapse at that point. But it could have definitely, it wouldn't have hurt anything. It's a good question. I'm not the right person to ask, but it's an interesting one that socialists have been debating for years. Cambodia was facing mass starvation. This is what led Pol Pot to pursue extreme measures. Yeah, basically. There wasn't much that he could do. So they basically socialized poverty, like, the version of communism that your grade school teacher tells you communism is. They just shared all the food. It was basically, the communism is when nobody makes any food because nobody works all day, and then you just share all the food. And that is, in fact, not what communism is, but it's kind of what Cambodia was forced to do because of the U.S. bombing campaigns. The West essentially utilized Tito against the USSR, but as soon as the USSR collapsed, they turned their eye on destroying Yugoslavia. That is a good point, too. That's what I was talking about with, like, I really disagree with the beefs that Tito had with Stalin, or I side with Stalin in those, and it was like Yugoslavia was used as a propaganda tool and political tool of the West to bash the USSR. Then as soon as the USSR falls, boom, Yugoslavia is getting bombed and ripped apart by terrorists. So it's like, you should have sided with the big guys. You should have known better than to side with what the US was saying. All right, everybody. This has been a great stream. I hope you like this format. I don't know if we're gonna do interviews like this every time from now on. Sometimes I just like to hop on here and cover some videos and some news stories and stuff. But every once in a while, I think I'll throw one of these interviews at you because they're fun. Unfortunately, I don't have any more topics to discuss today. I thought about bringing up a video of Vaush and Slavoj Žižek talking about Yugoslavia. But if you want more Yugoslavia content, I realized I already did a video on that. So if you search Midwestern Marx Yugoslavia, you'll see me debunking the arguments of Vaush and Slavoj. If you're interested in this topic and want to learn more, I also recommend checking out Michael Parenti's book, To Kill a Nation. Other than that, thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next one. Peace.